Mark Henderson heard a strange sound coming from the wall while renovating his new home in Toronto. In June 2023, when he hit it with a hammer, it made a hollow sound as if there was an empty space behind it. 35-year-old software developer Mark was curious about this situation but didn't pay much attention to it at the time, until 3 days later when he broke down the wall and found a secret room behind it. The beginning of this story actually goes back 6 months earlier. Mark had just gotten married and was looking for a house with his wife Sarah to build a home together. They fell in love with this 1920s house in the Riverdale neighborhood at first sight. 3-story large garden, classic brick structure. The price seemed reasonable too, actually quite affordable compared to similar houses in the area. Real estate agent Mrs. Patterson had said the house hadn't been sold for a long time. The previous owner, Harold Whitman, had died in 2018. His heirs decided to sell the house but couldn't find a buyer for 5 years. Maybe that's why the price was so reasonable, she explained. Mark and Sarah thought this was a lucky situation. When they bought the house, the neighbors welcomed them warmly but said strange things about Harold Whitman. He had died at age 75, spending the last 20 years of his life in complete isolation. He didn't talk to anyone, did his shopping online. Only cargo workers could see him. Neighbor Mrs. Thompson said he was a very strange man but didn't harm anyone. Mark initially planned to do only basic renovation. Paints, electrical installation, kitchen cabinets, and other simple work. But when he started working, he saw that the condition of the house was worse than they thought. Harold Whitman hadn't maintained the house at all in recent years. Everywhere was full of moisture stains, cracked paints, and old installations. His first discovery was in the basement. There he found boxes full of old photos, books, and documents. These were from Harold's youth, university diploma, old letters, newspaper clippings from the 1960s. While going through these, Mark learned that Harold was actually a very active person. He had worked as a journalist, done war reporting, received awards. In these boxes were also photos of Harold's youth. In the 1960s, he was very handsome, a confident young man. He studied journalism at university, started working at Toronto Star immediately after graduation. In his early years, he covered sports news, then moved to crime reporting, and finally started doing investigative journalism. In the 1970s, Harold's articles were very famous. He was particularly talented at exposing political corruption. He exposed one by one that mayors took bribes, contractors issued fake invoices, irregularities were committed in public tenders. Because of this, he became very famous, appeared on television programs, gave conferences. This discovery made Mark curious. How could such a successful journalist turn into a complete hermit in his later years? The documents in the basement showed that Harold was very active until then suddenly everything stopped. After 1985, there were no articles, no news, no social activities. Mark started researching this topic. He found interesting information about Harold Whitman in internet searches. He was a very famous investigative journalist from 1960 to one. He was particularly successful at exposing political scandals. But after 1985, none of his articles were published. He had no interviews. When he told Sarah about this situation, his wife wasn't very interested. She said Mark was very curious and should focus on renovation. But Mark's curiosity was growing. Why had Harold suddenly quit his career? Was there something secret in this house? As renovation work continued, Mark discovered stranger things. There were gaps not shown in the house plan. Especially the walls of the second-floor study were suspiciously thick. When he measured with a meter, the measurements he took from outside and inside didn't match. It was as if there was a hidden area between the walls. This was the room where Harold spent most of his time. Neighbors had told that Harold would constantly sit in this room in his final years, watching outside through the window. The light of this room would stay on until late at night, as if he couldn't sleep. According to Mrs. Thompson, Harold would sometimes walk in the garden at midnight, as if waiting for someone. Curious about this situation, Mark started checking the wall with a hammer. While the left wall made normal sounds, the right wall made hollow sounds. Mark asked construction worker Ahmed about this situation. Ahmed said that sometimes there are such gaps in old houses. They might have been made for insulation, but Mark wasn't convinced. That evening, when he was alone at home, he examined the wall in more detail. When he illuminated it with a flashlight, he noticed a very thin line in the paint on the wall, as if there was a secret door. When he felt around with his fingers, he sensed that part of the wall was slightly movable. This line was very expertly done. It was impossible to notice with the normal eye. Mark was very curious about how Harold had hidden this door. The shape of the wood was visible under the paint layers. He wanted to learn what was behind this wall that had been painted repeatedly over the years. Sarah was on a business trip, and Mark's curiosity had become unbearable. He decided to open that wall with a hammer and crowbar. In the first blows, only plaster pieces fell. But then he encountered a wooden frame. This was really a secret door, and it had been closed for 40 years. When the door opened, an incredible cloud of dust came out. Mark started coughing. His eyes watered. The smell of 40-year-old dust and moisture filled his nose. When he completely opened the door, a small room of about 2 square meters appeared before him. Inside was very dusty and smelled of moisture. When he illuminated it with a flashlight, what he saw took Mark's breath away. Dozens of photos, documents, and newspaper clippings were hung on the walls. In the center was a desk with files, notebooks, and an old typewriter on it. But most surprisingly, there was a small bed and mini refrigerator in one corner of the room. Harold had used this room not only to store his documents, but also to live. The bed was worn out. Countless nights had been spent here. Inside the mini refrigerator were rotten food remains. Harold had lived hiding in this secret room in his final years. Mark spent hours examining that room that night. This was Harold Whitman's secret study. The documents on the walls were related to political events from 1970 to 1985. But these weren't ordinary news. There were very secret documents, phone records, bank account statements, even some photos. The documents were very systematically organized. Harold had placed them in chronological order, writing explanations on each document, where and when he found it, from whom he got it, what it proved was written. This man was really a very professional investigator. Most surprising was that these documents were related to a major scandal. Corruption allegations had emerged in the Ontario provincial government in 1983, but the issue was closed. The documents Harold collected showed the real dimensions of this corruption. Millions of dollars in bribes, fake tenders, missing public money. In the desk drawers were even more secret documents. These were information Harold had received from his private sources. Records documenting in detail the secret agreements between bank managers, politicians, businessmen, records of phone conversations, photos of secret meetings, account movements of bribe money. In the notebooks on the desk was Harold's handwriting. He had taken notes like, "I must finish this story. The evidence is sufficient, but very dangerous." In the final pages were fear-filled expressions. "They're following me. Phone is being tapped. They might have entered my house." Such anxious sentences. Paranoia symptoms were clearly visible in what Harold wrote. In his final months, he constantly felt under threat. He couldn't trust anyone. He was afraid that even his friends might betray him. Even when grocery shopping, he found ordinary people suspicious. Mark couldn't sleep that night. If these documents were real, Harold had faced a very dangerous situation. And he had hidden these documents in 1985, closed the room, isolated himself from the world. What had happened to him? Why hadn't he published this story? The next morning, Mark tried to gather more information about Harold's final days. He talked to neighbors, learned details about Harold's behavior. After 1985, he had really changed completely. First, he stopped receiving guests, then stopped answering the phone, finally stopped talking to anyone. Mrs. Thompson remembered that Harold looked very bad in the summer of 1985. He had lost weight. His hair had fallen out. He constantly looked worried. Even when doing garden work, he would constantly look around, as if afraid someone was watching him. When the postman came, he would look from behind the curtains, wouldn't open the door. The next day, Mark went to the library and researched newspaper archives from 1980. During that period, major scandal allegations had really emerged in the Ontario government. Several ministers had resigned, but the issue didn't get much coverage in the media. Harold's collected documents explained why this topic was suppressed. Harold's research revealed not just superficial corruption, but a much deeper system. Politicians, businessmen, bank managers, even some police chiefs were part of this network. Everything from public tenders to tax collection was controlled. According to the documents, those involved in the scandal weren't just politicians. Construction companies, bank managers, even some media owners were involved. That's why the story was suppressed before it fully emerged. Harold was about to expose this truth when he was somehow silenced. Mark spent days examining these documents. Harold's research was really very detailed. Banking records, phone conversations, witness statements, everything was there. If this information had been published at that time, it could have brought down the government. But why had Harold waited 40 years? Why hadn't he done anything? In other notebooks in the room were also clues about Harold's personal life. He had been married, had 2 children. But because of this scandal investigation, his wife had left him. His children didn't want to see their father either. Harold's personal life had also been shattered. In Harold's writings from late 1980, signs of deep depression were visible. He had lost his family. Friends had distanced themselves. He was having difficulties in his work life due to threats. His only goal was to expose this scandal, but the price was very heavy. He found the answer in the final pages of the notebooks. Harold had written that his house was entered one night in May 19. Nothing was stolen, but his files were searched. A week later, he received a threat that a bomb would be placed in his car. A month later, an anonymous call came from a bank telling him to stay silent. These threats didn't remain just words. Harold's car brake cables had been cut one day. Fortunately, he noticed and took it to the repair shop. Another day, they broke his house window at night. Harold realized his life was in danger and became afraid. At that point, Harold became scared and hid everything in this secret room. He left the documents here and isolated himself from the world. For 33 years, he kept this secret, but did nothing. Fear had paralyzed him. He would just sit in this room for hours, rereading his documents, thinking about what to do. In Harold's final notes, there was deep regret. The guilt of not being able to expose the truth had kept him awake for years. Every night he would come to this room and think until death about what he should do, but he could never find the courage. Mark was in a dilemma after this discovery. These documents were still very valuable. Most of the people involved in the scandal were still alive. Some were still in powerful positions. If this information were published, it would cause a huge uproar, but at the same time, it would be very dangerous. Among the documents was also a draft article Harold had prepared, a comprehensive text that told the entire scandal in detail, exposing it with names and evidence. Harold had finished this article in 1985, but couldn't send it to any newspaper. This 40-page text was a real bomb. Mark took a copy of that article and read it from beginning to end. Harold had really done perfect research. He had documented chronologically how the scandal developed, how decisions were made, how money was transferred. If this had been published at that time, a major earthquake would have occurred. When Sarah returned from her business trip, she saw the situation and was very scared. She told Mark not to get involved in this business, to look at what happened to Harold, to hand these documents over to police, not to put themselves in danger. But Mark's conscience wasn't at ease. These documents belonged to the public. Billions of dollars of corruption had been hidden, and the criminals had received no punishment. Harold had risked his life to expose this truth, but in the end became afraid and gave up. Now this responsibility had passed to Mark. Mark decided to do more detailed research about Harold's past. He found and read Harold's old articles in the Toronto News Archive. He really was a very talented journalist. The investigative news he wrote in the 1970s had exposed many scandals. He also found and called Harold's former colleagues. Most were curious about why Harold had disappeared after 9. A retired journalist named John Peterson told interesting things about Harold. Harold had become very paranoid in his final period, constantly thinking he was being followed. His colleagues wanted to help him, but Harold trusted no one. Peterson was also curious about what Harold's final big story was. Harold had told him he was after something big, that it would be the most important news of his career. But then he suddenly quit everything and disappeared. Peterson had been wondering what Harold had found ever since. Nights he would sit in that room for hours, re-examining the documents. In Harold's notebooks were very detailed plans, which document he would publish in which newspaper, how he would expose which politicians. Everything was planned, but none of it was implemented. Among Harold's personal belongings were also photos related to his family. His wife Jennifer was a very beautiful woman. His son Michael and daughter Susan were also very cute children, but there were no family photos after night. Harold had completely cut his relationship with his family. Mark tried to find Harold's family. Jennifer had died in 2010, married someone else, and taken a different surname. His children Michael and Susan were still alive. Michael was a doctor, Susan was a lawyer. Neither talked about their father Harold. When he called Michael and said he wanted to talk about his father, Michael was very cold. He said they hadn't seen their father since 1985, that the reason their mother left him was Harold's obsessions. Harold had become completely paranoid in his final period, constantly chasing conspiracies, neglecting his family. Learning these situations greatly affected Mark. While Harold was searching for truth, he had lost his own truth. His family had left him. Friends had distanced themselves. His professional life had ended. For 33 years, he had lived completely alone with this secret. What a great tragedy this was. But it also motivated Mark. He could do what Harold couldn't. Technology had advanced. There was internet. Information spread more easily. These documents could no longer be hidden. Truth could come out. Perhaps Harold's suffering wouldn't be in vain. To verify the originality of the documents, Mark consulted with an expert. Dr. Patricia Collins was a document analysis expert and dealt with such matters. When she examined the documents, she was very surprised. The documents Harold collected were definitely original. None were fake. Moreover, some had never seen daylight in that period. Dr. Collins also said these documents had historical value. They were the most detailed documentation about political corruption in the 1980s. They were very valuable even for academic studies. But she also added that they were very dangerous, reminding that bad things happened to journalists who made such exposures. Mark called a journalist friend named Tom Jenkins. Tom was an investigative writer for a major newspaper and was interested in such stories. When he told him the situation, Tom didn't believe it at first, but was shocked when he saw the documents. This was an incredible discovery. If true, it would be a major scandal, he said. Tom asked for a few days to examine the documents. He consulted expert friends, had the originality of the documents checked. The result was positive. The documents were real and still very valuable. Some of them had never seen daylight in that period. But Tom also said they needed to be careful. This was a very big job. If they published these documents, they could face very powerful people. They could be threatened like Harold, he warned. Mark was determined, but Sarah was very worried. Tom also gave ideas about how this news should be presented. Instead of just publishing 40-year-old documents, telling Harold's story would be more effective. How a journalist was silenced while trying to expose the truth. How he lived in fear for years. These were also part of the news. Arguments at home increased day by day. Sarah was afraid and didn't want Mark to get involved in this business. Why didn't they mind their own business? Why didn't they give these documents to police? She asked. But Mark didn't want to experience the regret Harold had lived with for years. Sarah was also worried about how this situation would affect their marriage. If Mark got involved in this business, they could receive threats. Their normal lives could be harmed. Sarah's job could also be damaged because she was an executive at a very large company. She didn't want to be associated with such scandals. Mark increased the time he spent in Harold's secret room. He worked at Harold's desk, on the same typewriter, examining the same documents, trying to understand his feelings. He better understood Harold's fears, anxieties, regrets. Now, Among the documents was also Harold's personal diary. In this diary, the changes in Harold's mental state were clearly visible. In 1983, he was very hopeful and excited. Sure, he would expose a major scandal. In 1984, anxieties had begun. In 1985, it had turned into complete paranoia. In his diary, Harold also talked about the problems he experienced with his family. He complained that his wife Jennifer didn't understand him, that his children were distancing themselves from him. But at the same time, he wrote that exposing this scandal was a duty for him, that he had to do it. In the final pages of the diary, Harold's desperation was clearly visible. He was very sad about hiding the truth, losing his family, being alone. But at the same time, he knew that publishing this information would be very dangerous for himself and his family. He was stuck in a dilemma, didn't know what to do. After thinking for weeks, Mark made his decision. He would publish these documents, but would try to be careful. Together with Tom, they prepared a strategy. They wouldn't release the documents all at once, but gradually, starting with small scandals and moving to bigger ones. The plan was very detailed. First, they would tell Harold's story, show how a journalist was silenced. Then the documents would be published step by step. There would be new revelations every week. This way, both security would be ensured and public interest would be kept alive. Tom had also taken security measures. Copies of the documents were stored in different places. Several people were informed about the situation. He had also taught Mark identity concealment tactics, explained how he could stay safe. When the first article came out, it caused a big stir. Harold's story attracted a lot of interest. How a successful journalist was silenced, how he lived in fear for 33 years, how he hid the truth was very touching. Readers felt sorry for Harold, appreciated his courage. In the second article, 40-year-old corruption allegations came back to the agenda. Former politicians denied it, but the documents were very clear. The second article contained bigger accusations. The third article had the biggest names. As each article came out, Mark's life became more complicated. Phone calls increased. Some appreciated, some threatened. Sarah became very tense, started asking Mark to quit this job. Arguments at home intensified. As expected, reactions were very harsh. Threatening phone calls started coming to Mark. Suspicious cars started being seen in front of his house. Sarah was very scared and wanted Mark to quit this job, but Mark wouldn't give up. Threats didn't remain just on the phone. One night, when Mark was returning home, he noticed someone was following him. He tried different routes, but the car wouldn't leave him alone. Finally, he entered a large shopping mall parking lot and disappeared. After this incident, Mark really got scared. When the fourth article came out, major panic began. Someone involved in the scandal came to Mark's house at night and knocked on the door. He asked where he found these documents. When Mark said he would call the police, the man quickly left, but the threat was clear. Sarah no longer wanted to stay at home. She moved to her mother's and asked Mark to come too. Mark was now experiencing what Harold had experienced. Fear, anxiety, loneliness, everything was the same. He better understood now why Harold had taken refuge in this room. Mark would sit in Harold's secret room at night hours, thinking he was experiencing what he felt. The same fears, the same anxieties, the same loneliness. He wondered how Harold could endure for 33 years. When the final article was published, a major scandal erupted. The prosecutor's office started an investigation. Former politicians were detained. The media showed great interest. After 40 years, Harold's documents had found justice. But the price of this was very heavy. Mark's life had completely changed. He had to take leave from work because he was constantly receiving threats. He couldn't leave home, had requested police protection. His relationship with Sarah had become very tense. The fear Harold experienced had become the fear Mark experienced. By publishing the documents, he had done the right thing, but the personal cost was very high. When he was alone at home, he understood what Harold felt. This was the price of exposing the truth. The coldness between him and Sarah lasted for months. Sarah was very angry with Mark, thought his getting involved in this business had ruined their marriage. Mark knew he had done the right thing, but didn't want to lose his marriage. He was in a dilemma, like Harold. After months, the situation gradually calmed down. The investigation continued. Some criminals were punished, some escaped. Threats to Mark decreased, but didn't completely stop. He had to completely change his life. Mark now started telling Harold's story. At conferences, on television programs, he told what Harold experienced, showed how dangerous journalism could be. He tried to keep Harold's memory alive. It took a long time for his relationship with Sarah to improve. They started going to couple therapy, tried to save their marriage. Sarah admitted Mark had done the right thing, but still couldn't get used to their lives changing. Mark decided to turn that secret room into a museum in Harold's memory. All documents are preserved there. Harold's story is told. He shows it to people, emphasizes the importance of journalism. Harold's struggle wasn't in vain. Today, Mark still lives in the same house, but that secret room is now a museum. Harold's documents are safe. The investigation continues. Mark's life returned to normal, but was never the same as before. He too had experienced the trauma Harold lived through. This story shows us that sometimes doing the right thing can require a very high price. Harold became afraid and gave up. Mark was brave and went to the end. Both experienced the same ending, loneliness and fear. But at least the truth came out. Justice was served. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next video.